Eboa had not said anything at the library because he had not known at the library that he had anything to say. He had gone back to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table, the overhead lights still on, Kitu and Kitala not yet home, the apartment carrying the particular silence of a space built for several people and temporarily emptied of all of them, the specific hollowness of shared rooms in the hours between uses, when the objects of other people's lives are visible, but the people are not. Kitu's textbook stacked with geometric exactness beside the chair he always used. Kitala's jacket on the hook by the door, the one nobody had asked about. The smell of the morning's Bissap faint in the walls, the way the smell of that tea embedded itself in the fabric of the apartment over weeks, inseparable from the place now, as if it had always been there. He opened his laptop with the intention of looking at the Loango coast, numbers the way Kitala had looked at them at the library, not flinching, doing the arithmetic, and spent 20 minutes doing this. Then, without fully intending to, he began a different search. South Cameroon, the archaeological record. He knew some of this already. The way you know the outline of your own country without knowing its interior. He knew the name Nachtigal, knew it because his uncle had mentioned it once in the context of French colonial infrastructure on the Sanoga River, which ran past the village where his mother's family was from, but he had not known that Nachtigal was an archaeological site. He had not known what was under the ground there. He found the dates on the third search. Iron production, reduction furnaces, the slag deposits at Akonétye and Bwambé-Sommet. He read the abstract of the first paper, then he pulled the full text. The carbon dates, multiple, corroborated across 3 separate sites, published across several decades in peer-reviewed journals he could access through the university system. He read each table carefully. Then he read the conclusions. He read without moving for 2 hours. The dates were not ambiguous. The carbon analysis was not in dispute. The scholarly consensus. And he could see the consensus forming across the papers the way consensus forms in a literature. Through accumulation, through corroboration, through the progressive narrowing of uncertainty, as each new excavation added its data to the existing picture, used not the word probable, but the word demonstrated. Oldest attested iron production in the region, South Cameroon. His part of South Cameroon. The latitude of his grandmother's village was the latitude of the oldest iron furnaces the archaeologists had found in this region of the continent. He read until his phone screen went dark, and he had to unlock it to keep reading. He told Kitu first, not because he had decided to tell Kitu first, because Kitu was in the kitchen making Bissap at 6 in the morning when Eboa came out of his room with his notes. The kitchen at 6 in the morning, the overhead light on, Kitu at the stove with the tall pot, the dried hibiscus flowers already submerged and already giving up their color, that particular dark red of sarbolo, deep and almost burgundy, which stained the water the moment it touched it and would not come back out. The smell of them already in the hallway, tart, floral, vaguely medical, the smell the apartment would carry for the rest of the day once the pot had been on the heat for 10 minutes. Kitu himself in the specific stillness of a person who has not yet spoken to anyone, upright at the stove, one hand on the pot's handle, the other loose at his side, wearing the focused quiet of his early hours. Before the day's demands had arranged themselves into their usual formations, he looked at Eboa once. "Oh, you didn't sleep."
I found something.
He put the notes on the kitchen table. Kitu looked at them from across the room, not crossing to them immediately, reading their arrangement from a distance first, the way he read material samples in the lab before he crossed the room to touch them. Then he crossed and read. He pronounced it correctly, which Eboa noticed. Kitu spent time, at some point before any serious conversation, on the phonology of the places he intended to discuss. Bwambé-Sommet, South Cameroon.
6th century BCE, corroborated across 3 sites. That's the oldest cluster in the published literature for this region.
Kitu picked up the notes. He turned to the data table on the 3rd page, radiocarbon dates, standard deviations, laboratory references, and read it with the systematic patience he brought to all tables, top to bottom, checking the standard deviations against the dates, verifying the column headings twice. This is your region.
Akonétye is 40 kilometers from Methodical. That's the commune my mother's family is from. The Sanaga River runs through both.
Kitu set the notes down. He looked at them for a moment with his hands at his sides, something moving in his face that was not yet an expression, but was the precursor to one, the look he wore when he had located a convergence he had not finished verifying. What's the earliest date for kilometres? Eboa had not thought about kilometres. He had spent the night thinking about South Cameroon.
I don't know why.
Kitu did not answer immediately. He poured the Bissap 2 cups without being asked and put one in front of Eboa's chair, then picked up his phone and opened a browser. He read for a few minutes. Eboa drank and did not ask. 2nd century BCE. An iron furnace at Sakuzi in the Katanga-Kasai zone, not confirmed at the same corroboration level as your sites, but in the published literature. 400 years between the South Cameroon cluster and the earliest iron evidence south of the Congo rainforest. He was not saying what this implied. He was stating dates and intervals with the precision of someone who had trained himself to state only what he had verified. But the expression on his face had completed whatever it had begun.
We should tell the others.
Not yet. Let me read more of this first. What the furnace was, a shaft of clay built upward from a base of packed earth, cylindrical, slightly tapered, rising between 1 and 1.5 meters, the exact dimensions reconstructed by the archaeologists from the footprint and the surviving wall fragments, since no furnace of this type was preserved intact at any of the South Cameroon sites. What survived was the floor, the positions of the tires, the collapsed wall sections, the slag. From these, the researchers reconstructed the form, the courses of clay, each layer applied wet, dried, fired before the next went on. This required days of preparation before any ore entered the structure. The people who built furnaces here did not build them improvised. The tires, the clay pipes through which air was driven into the charge, were set low on the shaft, angled downward and inward toward the center of the reduction zone, 2 or 3 per furnace. At the angles the process required. The angles were required because what mattered was the temperature at the heart of the fuel bed, not the temperature at the walls. At 1100 degrees Celsius, iron oxide surrenders its oxygen to carbon monoxide. Below 1100 degrees Celsius, it does not. This is not a threshold that presents itself to the eye. It presents itself to the blast, and to what the blast produces, and to the person watching what comes out. The people who built and fired these furnaces had not written down this threshold in any form that survived. They had arrived at it through the accumulated logic of the process, what the ore does at different temperatures, what the carbon requires, what happens to the bloom when the reduction is incomplete, what has to be done differently the next time. The threshold was known before it was measured. The word 1100 came later. The knowing came first. The ore came from the laterite soils of the hillsides above the river, the characteristic red-brown soils of the forest-savanna transition at this latitude, developed on metamorphic rock, iron-rich. Soils that have been accumulating iron oxide through weathering for a very long time, and that the eye learns to read as iron-bearing once the eye has been taught what to look for. The ore was processed before it entered the furnace, crushed by stone, sorted by hand for density and purity, sometimes roasted in a separate fire to drive off moisture and raise the effective iron content of the charge. This preparation happened before the furnace was loaded, in a sequence of operations that preceded the reduction proper by hours or days, and that required its own knowledge of which ore, from which stratum, at what grain size, at what moisture content. The charcoal was produced in separate controlled burns. Charcoal is the form of carbon the reduction process requires. It achieves and holds the necessary temperature without the water content and volatiles of green wood. Its density was calibrated by practice to the specific thermal demands of this furnace type, in this ore, at this elevation. The ratio of ore to charcoal in the charge was not recorded. It was known. The bellows double action, operating continuously through the heat cycle, were worked by hand, 2 people, one on each side of the furnace, the bellows compressing and expanding in alternation so that the airflow into the tires was constant rather than pulsed. This required sustained physical labor across the full reduction cycle, which ran from early morning through the afternoon and into the evening, 8 to 12 hours depending on the charge and the weather. Interrupting the bellows dropped the temperature of the charge. A temperature drop below the reduction threshold could not be recovered simply by pumping harder. The 2 people working the bellows understood this. The knowledge of when to stop, and when stopping would cost the entire cycle, was part of what was known. What came out of the furnace at the end of the cycle, when the wall was broken open, as the wall always was, since no furnace of this type could be emptied any other way, was a bloom, the raw, fused mass of reduced iron and slag. Heavy and dark, difficult to handle. The bloom was not iron. The bloom was the beginning of iron. It required reheating in a second fire and then hammering, the extended, systematic work in which the smith drove the slag, still liquid at the working temperature, trapped between the iron crystals, out through the surface of the mass while consolidating the iron grains into a coherent structure. The hammering could take hours. What emerged from the hammering? If the cycle had gone correctly and the ore had been correctly selected and prepared, and the bellows had not interrupted at the wrong moment, was a billet of wrought iron. Iron that held an edge. Iron that could be worked further into blades, hoe heads, axe heads, points. These moved through the trade networks. The knowledge that produced them moved with the people who held it. What existed in South Cameroon in the 6th century BCE, the forest-savanna mosaic at this latitude. Closed canopy to the south, gallery forest along the Sanaga and its tributaries, the ground opening towards savanna where the elevation changed. The laterite soils, red and iron-rich. Communities that had been in this landscape long enough to learn what the soil contained, which deposits were worth processing, which were not, and how to extract what the soil contained. The slag heaps that the archaeologists would excavate 2,600 years later were not, at the time of their formation, archaeological evidence. They were waste, the byproduct of production, set aside near the furnaces as refuse accumulates, acquiring no significance at the time except that of residue. The furnaces themselves were periodically rebuilt, the tires renewed when they cracked, the dimensions of the shaft recalculated each time against the available clay and the requirements of the process. None of this was written down. All of it was transmitted, from the people who knew to the people who were learning, in the only form that practical knowledge has ever reliably taken, which is doing it beside someone and watching, and then doing it alone, and then doing it beside someone who does not yet know. The work continued. The slag accumulated. The forest was where it was, what the material record contains when the archaeologists excavate it. Temperature history encoded in the chemistry of the slag. Process evidence in the tire fragments and their angles. Timeline from the carbon in the charcoal. The architecture of the shaft reconstructed from the floor plan and the collapsed courses of fired clay. Botanical remains from the site vicinity, documenting the local landscape. Pollen, preserved in adjacent soil contexts, identifying which species were present and in what proportions, and what their presence implies about land use and disturbance. What the material record does not contain: the word used for the furnace, the word used for the ore, the word used for the bloom when it came out of the broken wall for the first time and was iron, actual iron, dense and dark and holdable, cooling in someone's hands. The word used for what that felt like, or whether there was a word for it, or whether the feeling was old enough by then that no one needed a word because everyone already knew. The record contains the result. The record does not contain the knowing.